And what had happened was that an atheist couple who lived close to the church, who obviously didn't like the church, had got on his website, downloaded a manual on parenting, cherry-picked out of it the so-called spare the rod, spoil the child scriptures, sent them to the South African Human Rights Commission, and accused this church of basically teaching abuse against children. And you cannot allow the Human Rights Commission to set a precedent which says that they can now cherry-pick whatever scriptures they don't particularly like. The definition was very much narrowed back to what our Constitution says it should be, which is you can say anything you like, but it must not amount to, among other things, an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm. And those two must run parallel. You would think that kill the farmer, kill the Boer would be like textbook hate speech. I said to him, how can you have the prevention of hate crimes and hate speech and you don't actually define the word hate? And his response was, look it up in the dictionary. The challenge is in law that once a law is in force, it is enforceable. If you have vagueness, if there are maybe unintended consequences that can result, there's a high potential that that can then be weaponized and then used against people. The CRL's report had a completely different solution that it was proposing. And what it was attempting to do was to say, we need to regulate the whole of the religious space. We need to appoint peer review committees. We need to appoint, let's say, people of good reputation. And they're now going to be oversighting everybody under the Christian banner or whatever faith it is. And they will be looking to make sure that what is being practiced and taught and preached or whatever it is acceptable. They would be what they call the final arbiter of religion and, to quote again, have final decision powers in religious disputes.
That's a very scary statement.
If you conduct this investigation into the Christian faith and you then come up with conclusions and you want to pass legislation to regulate and license and control the Christian sector, that's going to apply equally to us. We haven't even had a say. And her response was, well, I'm looking at the census, Christians are first, you're next. And then there seems to be a complete sort of disconnect. Where's that money going to come from? In all likelihood, if you are licensed, your church is licensed, you are licensed, who's going to pay your license fee? You are. So effectively, it's going to be a tax for yourself to be policed. If you license and thereby control and can shut down and potentially criminalize voices that you don't like, then that, I would say, is another serious threat to not just the faith communities, but...
Michael Swain, welcome to the In HeinzSight BoldCast.
Great to be with you. Great to be.
Thank you for being here, sir. I'm so glad we can do this. I'm excited about this talk, and I'm very grateful that you have joined us. You are one of my heroes, living heroes, because of what you do at Freedom of Religion South Africa. And there's so many people that actually don't know the victories that you have won. You and your team have had such a positive ripple effect, and it's like one of those things where people don't even know about it, and I'm just amazed. But we're going to talk a bit about that and about something very specific today, and that's something I think everyone who is in the faith community, especially Christians, need to know about. But first, please tell us a bit more about what is Freedom of Religion South Africa. How did you get involved in that, and what is it that you guys focus on?
Well, as the name might give you a small clue, freedom of religion.
Yeah.
So the way that Freedom of Religion South Africa, or known as 4SA, came about was quite interesting and I think very providential. I have a good friend called Pastor Andrew Selly, and he was one of the founders and the leaders of the Josh Gen churches and then the 412 churches, based as he was in the sort of Blouberg Strand area. And one day he gets a letter from the South African Human Rights Commission. And what had happened was that an atheist couple who lived close to the church, who obviously didn't like the church, had got on his website, downloaded a manual on parenting, cherry-picked out of it the so-called spare the rod, spoil the child scriptures, sent them to the South African Human Rights Commission and accused this church of basically teaching abuse against children.
Wow.
So Andrew and the church by association then received a letter from the Human Rights Commission to say, remove those scriptures from your teaching materials, never teach on them again, and send your pastors for, quote, sensitization training.
What?
So Andrew phoned me and we were friends. And I said, Tim, listen,
goodness.
this is not an issue of whether or not you should or should not, in some way lovingly discipline your child, maybe a little smack on the hand or a pat on the bum or whatever it might be. It is everything to do with your right to preach and teach and believe and to live out, obviously within the confines of the law, what you believe. And you cannot allow the Human Rights Commission to set a precedent which says that they can now cherry pick whatever scriptures they don't particularly like, churches generally preaching and teaching.
Yeah, because imagine that floodgate that's going to open up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's always the danger in law, is that if you get a bad precedent, it doesn't just apply to you, it applies to everybody else. And so at that point, Pastor Andrew Selly teamed up with a very bright young advocate who had recently joined his church called Nadine Badenhorst, and they began to defend this particular issue. And they formed 4SA, Freedom of Religion South Africa, as a kind of just to slightly ring fence it from the church.
Yeah, to have a separate entity. Yeah.
Exactly. And of course, very quickly discovered that this was just the tip of the iceberg, because although religious freedom writ large, which is your freedom of conscience, thought, belief, opinion, and of course faith, is a universally accepted and entrenched human right. Section 18 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, for example. But it's enshrined in many other international law treaties and instruments, and also in many national ones.
Like our own Constitution.
Yes, like Section 15 is where it's
which is very important.
And therefore it is a foundational and fundamental human right. And it's not just your right to believe what you want to believe in the privacy of your own home. In other words, or go to church on Sunday and worship in church. It is your right to actually live out that faith. It's to express it in private and in public.
That's important.
Very important. It's very much a central part of your human dignity. It's not something that you sort of check in the door as you leave your house in the morning and go off to work. It comes with you. It informs,
it's
really guides who you are. It's integral to your persona. So you can't interfere with it lightly, nor ever should you. But obviously this was an overreach by the South African Human Rights Commission. And so one of the problems, of course, is that when you start to see what's happening, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, you can see that there is a steady trend on multiple different levels to scrape away, to erode this fundamental human right, to the extent now, sadly, that in some countries, any meaningful right to religious freedom, even in those where it formerly existed, I'm talking about Western nations now, to a large extent, it's actually been eroded away completely. It no longer has any meaningful role or value. But in South Africa, with Freedom of Religion South Africa, for I say largely, the line has been held, which is really, really key.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with you guys. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
sure.
Well, that's really what we exist to do. So just to be, for the sake of clarity and of interest, religious freedom, of course, is a generic right. It doesn't apply just to, say, the Christian faith.
Yeah.
It applies to all faiths equally.
Of course.
And it is not in any way doctrinally biased. So we, for us, say we are faith neutral, we are doctrinally neutral, we don't favour any particular interpretation of anything above anybody else. And we're also politically neutral. And so we work with whatever political parties, anybody who's willing to step up and defend religious freedom.
So does that mean, if I can take that thought further, does it mean you would represent someone from a different faith as your own?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
it hasn't happened, but...
Well, we haven't done so in a formal capacity, but informally we certainly have.
Okay.
For example, there was a case which was in the media not so long ago about a South African army major, a woman who wanted to wear a head covering under her beret. And the South African Defence Force said, no, you're not allowed to do that. Now, there was a case, and a very important case, because it just, I think, illustrates well the fact that this is a universal right of a young Hindu girl. It was called the Pillay case. It went to the Constitutional Court. And she had gone through a kind of a coming-of-age ceremony, and as a consequence of that, she had a small stud in her nose. And of course, she goes back to the school, which is a public school. It's not a school that's not a private school. And they tell her, take it out.
That's against the school rules.
It's against the school rules. It's jewelry, whatever. And she said, no, this is a part of my religious expression. And the Constitutional Court said, yes, it was. And it was therefore allowed. And the principle there is, of course, reasonable accommodation. In other words, you cannot say absolutely no to a right and therefore remove it altogether. You actually have to see how you can reasonably accommodate it, even if some other things have to maybe give way as a consequence.
Okay.
And so that's a very important principle. In the same case as at SNDF, like you couldn't see this thing under her. Beret, reasonably accommodated. I don't think that case ever went to court. I think they just settled it. But that is the principle. And so, yes, that would be where we would be standing up for people of all faiths and beliefs. Because, again, think of the consequence. If you say no to the beret, then what about somebody who's wearing a crucifix as a piece of jewelry? Do you tell them to take it off? Well, arguably, yes. What about a young girl with a sort of promise ring? Do you tell it? So it's kind of good for the goose, good for the gander.
Yeah. And I think, it's wise for you guys to focus on legal side of things because it makes it automatically neutral. Your personal motivation is your own beliefs, but the way that you handle cases and address these things is from a legal point of view. Like we are defending the right of the expression of your religion and your faith, and freedom of religion must also go quite hand in hand with the freedom of speech, right?
Absolutely.
How does that work together, do you think?
Well, it works very closely together.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about other things today as well, but one of the big issues and areas that we've been involved with has been protecting freedom of expression in the religious context. So we have, for instance, defended in the magistrates' court a young evangelist called Simeon Chetty, who said some things that were very offensive to the Hindu faith.
Okay.
And the fact is, offense is not hate speech, and yet they were trying to claim that it was. And fortunately, in the midst of that case, we had the result from the Constitutional Court on the Kulani case, which you might remember was somebody who made some really horrible, vilifying remarks about homosexuals and homosexuality. He was a journalist.
Okay.
And the Constitutional Court actually said that what he had said was hate speech, but they clarified what hate speech was in the civil context.
Which is important these words have meanings and they have impact, and so they have to be clarified.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So very critical. But this is maybe where it gets a little crazy. In the civil definition of hate speech, so we're talking about if you say something that breaks that barrier, then you can obviously be maybe made to apologize or pay a fine or something like that.
Yeah.
The definition was very much narrowed back to what our Constitution says it should be, which is you can say anything you like, but it must not amount to, among other things, an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm. And those two must run parallel. So you would think that a classic illustration of hate speech, and I can see you smiling because you know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, it's a big thing in the news at the moment. So
you would think that kill the farmer, kill the Boer would be like textbook hate speech. In
Yeah.
other words, who do we want you to hate? Farmers, particularly Afrikaans farmers, Boers.
It falls right into that definition you just
What
gave.
do we want to do with them? Kill them.
Yeah.
But
Slit the throat of whiteness.
For some reason, the Constitutional Court has said that that's a struggle song, and therefore, it's sort of somehow exempted. But I honestly can't think of a better definition, and I would question why a struggle song is still relevant some 35 plus years after the struggle is actually over.
Led by a guy who was a child, during the struggle. So,
well,
anyway.
but therein lies hate speech. So.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges is that the more broadly you define hate speech, and we also now have the Hate Speech Act, or in fact it's called the Prevention of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act, which is very concerning because it doesn't define, for example, hate. I was actually on a radio interview with Deputy Minister John Jeffrey at the time, who's no longer in Parliament or in that role. And I said to him, how can you have the prevention of hate crimes and hate speech and you don't actually define the word hate?
Yeah.
How do you know that what you're saying
crosses
that threshold if you don't? And his response was, look it up in the dictionary.
Oh, wow.
And I said to him, well, look, I hate cabbage. I mean, like when is this level of hate sufficient, or is it purely subjective? And unfortunately, the way that the Act is in its current form, it is purely subjective. Which is crazy because in the civil definition, it has to be a level of detestation, of vilification. In other words, you've really got to lay it on thick. Whereas the way that it's defined in the criminal law at this point in time is it's anything that causes you substantial emotional harm.
Oof, which is so broad.
Whatever that is.
That can mean so much.
Or social harm, which is anything that undermines the social fabric of South Africa, which again is so vague.
Yeah.
So you actually have a very, let's say, tight definition in the civil sanction, which is, I think, the right way to go, because obviously the more free speech you allow, the more robust debates you have, and typically it's in the context of those, solid discussions
which
that
is
you find yourself, you find one another, you find a solution, or else the person who's saying crazy things is actually obviously saying crazy things, and everybody now knows it.
Yeah, and that's the foundation of a democracy, right?
Exactly.
Supposedly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this criminal act, which the president signed into law just before the last election, but is not actually signed into implementation. So it isn't actually active yet, but it's like a sword of Damocles that sort of hangs over everybody's heads.
What is a Damocles? That's a big word for me.
A sword of Damocles, though, is just a
help me.
It's a Greek. It's an old Greek sort of legend story about a king who had a sword over his throne dangling by a thread, and that thread was getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and so he never knew quite when it was going to
happen.
And then
all right,
out.
I'm learning something. Thank you.
So, sorry.
No, it's good.
But in other words, that's what the Hate Speech Act is like.
Yeah, it's hanging.
It's hanging. It could any minute now just be implemented, and then we've got a problem because
that might open the floodgates.
Well, the big challenge and why we always and often get involved and contest laws that we see are eroding religious freedom. Often it's in the definition, like the devil's in the definition.
The details,
and the challenge is in law that once a law is in force, i.e. passed into law, it is enforceable. Yeah. And if you have vagueness, if there are maybe unintended consequences that can result, there's a high potential that can then be weaponized and then used against people. So let me give you an example, just to wrap up the hate speech element of it. So there are some 20 categories that are protected from having any form of expression, hateful expression, that they might find, let's say, offensive. One of them is, of course, gender. And what is gender these days? Nobody really knows. And although there is a defense in the law for hate speech for the religious community or legitimate religious expression, it actually isn't really a defense at all, because it's in such a vaguely worded way that really what it says is that, if you say something in the religious context that may amount to hate speech, you're protected as long as it doesn't actually amount to hate speech according to the definition in the Act. In other words, double speak.
What?
I mean, it's really not a defense.
That's terrible.
Which is terrible. Now
it's almost like they designed the Act for the purpose of attacking the religious communities and others, because it's already there. It's like they're covering their bases with the gender thing and then opening it up to attacking religious freedom. It seems to be, it might be part of, and they just play dumb. When you confront them, they're like, we never do that. It'll never happen. It's like the land expropriation thing. No, it just says that. We're not going to do it. That's what it seems like to me.
And that was very much Deputy Minister John Jeffrey's approach. It'll never happen, don't worry.
Yeah, but if the wording is there, then it can be abused. That's the thing.
It's like a ticking bomb.
Yeah, it takes one, set of parents, like you had for as I started, one set of parents who go, if I read this correctly, in the way that suits me, I can fit anything in there. I feel someone committed hate speech against me. They can shut down a church. They can shut down a school. They can. It's just a matter of
It goes
time.
very broad as well. So it isn't necessarily that I said something to you, but let's supposing I say something on this podcast recording, or you say something on this podcast recording, and somebody else somewhere else at some other space and time actually hears it and they take offense. They can still bring an action.
Yeah, because that's how broad the definition is.
It is so broad. And one of the problems is, of course, that let's supposing that I, on Sunday, in speaking, or you're preaching on Sunday, let's make you the full guy.
Yes, please.
And
I'll take it.
You say something along the lines of, when God created the heavens and the earth and he made mankind, he made them male and female. He did not make a third gender. The Bible does not recognize a third gender.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm listening to that and I maybe have a belief system that says that you can be whichever gender you want to be, and I must be respected as that gender of my choice, and that is an integral part of my human dignity, then I can say that I'm deeply offended by what you said.
Yeah.
And potentially I can bring a charge against you. And if the court, and it might be a magistrate's court, because we're not talking things that start at the sort of high level, they normally start at the low level, where you've got even less likelihood of the judicial system actually really understanding or coming to grips with the nuances of the issue.
Okay.
They might decide, okay, you're guilty. I mean, here's the act. This is what it says. This is what you said. This is...
And then you're criminally liable.
5 years in jail.
That's
liable.
hectic.
So...
I mean, you would think these things can still be handled by the civil... in the civil way that we already have established.
It should be. Again, one of the big problems we have with the whole hate speech criminal law, the Act, is that it's only really in the most extreme circumstances you should be criminalizing hate speech. And we do not believe, and there are standards, international standards for that, and we do not see that those standards were adhered to in the passage of this law. So there's multiple reasons why it's a really bad law, and we will certainly, and we are in an ongoing way contesting it and pushing back against it.
That's good. Thank you for that. The other reason we need to talk today is about what the CRL are up to in terms of, once again, trying to regulate religious activity or religious organizations. So please bring us up to speed. Who's the CRL? What have they already tried to do? And what are they doing now again?
Well, the CRL is actually an institution of the state. It's set up in Chapter 9 of the Constitution. So these institutions are known as Chapter 9 institutions. And you'll have heard of some others, I'm sure. We've mentioned the Human Rights Commission. That's one. You've heard of the Electoral Commission. You've probably heard of the Public Protector, the Commission for Gender Equality. So these
all
are
under Section 9.
They're all Chapter 9 institutions, sort of known as. And what they're basically set up to do by the Constitution is to almost be like entities that are separate from the ongoing, let's say, process of Parliament and whatever. And they are almost like special protectors. They're like ombudsmen. They look after and give special attention and focus to areas which are considered to be critical to the overarching functionality of the Constitution and obviously the society it's intended to create.
If I may ask, just to take us back a moment, who decided that that's necessary? Is it all part of setting up the Constitution?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It was right back at the get-go. And it's designed to give their sort of like extra belts and braces to critical elements. Like, for example...
So policing the police kind of idea.
The Electoral Commission obviously makes sure that elections are free and fair and independent.
Okay. Sorry.
Kind of thing, yes. The Public Protector, for example, very much has a role and played a very powerful role in bringing to light some of the challenges and problems under the President Jacob Zuma rule. So,
but not without its challenges.
Of course not. But at least there's
something
that entity that can actually play that role. Anyway, so the CRL stands for the Cultural, Religious and Linguistics Rights Commission.
Say that 5 times fast.
A big mouthful, which is why it's known as the CRL.
Yeah.
Sometimes the CRL Rights Commission. And it has really a sort of a triple mandate, which is not perfect. It looks after and protects and promotes and upholds. It can conduct investigations. It can certainly run educational programs and the like on the areas of religion, language, and culture. And its primary role is also to keep unity and harmony in those areas and between the different elements of those areas. So it's part of the sort of cohesion fabric of the country. It is probably one of the less known commissions, and typically you don't necessarily hear very much about it or from it until 2017. A chair was appointed called Mrs. Toko Nkwanazi Khalufa, and she decided to conduct an investigation into what she saw as abuses in the faith communities. So you might remember back in that day, there were quite a lot of crazy things happening. There were snake eaters, there were grass eaters, there were petrol drinkers, there was the so-called prophet of doom.
Yeah, doom spraying.
Who sprayed insecticide into people's
faces. Yeah,
listen,
so unfortunately, she wasn't wrong that there were abuses.
There were, absolutely there
That's
were.
the problem.
Yeah.
There was unfortunately a place to start from.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And so they dug into that, they investigated it thoroughly, and they came up with a report which they produced, which was entitled The Commercialization of Religion and Abuse of People's Belief Systems.
So
that was a formal report.
They like long names.
It was a long report. It went on and on, obviously detailing all these abuses, and it looked at Timothy Omotoso was, of course, mentioned at that time. He was ongoing. Prophet Bushiri.
Did you look at the report? Was it a legit report?
The report was legit. The examples that they gave were legit.
Were real. Yeah.
But when we analysed them, every single abuse that, quote unquote, that they identified is still covered by existing South African law. In other words,
that's important.
What they were showing was that there are crimes being committed in the faith communities. Well, that's not necessarily anything new.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know your Bible, you'll know that Judas was stealing out of the purse. I mean, he was in the inner circle.
Yeah.
And so, crimes have happened. But very importantly, of course, is there's no such thing as a spiritual crime. A crime is a crime is a crime. It doesn't matter who commits it, whether it's a pastor, politician, or a postman. If you commit a crime, then you should be charged with that crime, go through the due process, and if you're found guilty, obviously convicted and sentenced to whatever the court may decide. Secondarily, there's no such thing as a defense of religious freedom to a crime. So you can't say, as the prophet of doom did, well, God told me that if I sprayed insecticide in somebody's face, they'd be healed. Actually, apparently they got serious sort of, lung complications. But no, he was charged with, rightly so, and convicted of 4 charges of assault. And he was then sentenced to a jail sentence, and then he had the option to pay a fine. And if he ever did any such thing again, he would go straight to jail. So there are laws.
It was dealt with, yeah.
And when the laws are applied correctly and prosecuted well, they work, problem solved.
Okay.
So there was a lot of, obviously, concern because the CRL's report had a completely different solution that it was proposing. And what it was attempting to do was to say, we need to regulate the whole of the religious space. We need to appoint peer review committees. We need to appoint, let's say, people of good reputation from different, Christian structures and different Muslim structures and Hindu structures and whatever. And they're now going to be oversighting everybody under the Christian banner or whatever faith it is. And they will be looking to make sure that what is being practiced and taught and preached or whatever it is acceptable.
To this overarching
committee.
To
the overarching committee.
Oh.
And, of course, the CRL said that, obviously, if there's a dispute, then the CRL, which is an institution of state, they would be what they called the final arbiter of religion and, to quote again, have final decision powers in religious disputes.
That's a very scary statement.
Well, whatever way you looked at it, and they tried to, of course, dress it up, and they always try to dress it up as, this is self-regulation. We're just there to help.
Yeah, the state is just going to hang in the background and not interfere with religious matters.
But if you have a commission appointed by the state, financed by the state, with their decisions
controlled by
the state, how is that not
with agendas
control?
Of course
it is.
Yeah.
So it was fiercely opposed, I think would be the best way of putting it. And opposed by a broad cross-section of all the faith communities, but including the more traditional denominations as well, who also spoke out against it. And, of course, what they were trying to say to those denominations was, don't worry, we're not after you, we're after the other guys. But fortunately, they weren't taken in. And I'll just give you one quote. Again, this is the quote that was stated then, so whether it still applies today, I can't say. But then Stephen Breslin, who's the Archbishop of Cape Town and president of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, this is what he said. He said, a recommendation that new laws be introduced to enforce registration of pastors and ministers is overkill, and a response that one would expect more from a totalitarian state than a constitutional democracy. He's 100% right.
Yeah.
And
wow.
That was probably the general sense of, sometimes said in slightly more extreme terms, of everybody, almost without exception, who then made submissions over 6 days. So this was a report that was then taken to Parliament. And the CRL answers to the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry, otherwise known as COGTA. We'll all remember COGTA because they oversaw lockdown. And so they then opened up hearings in Parliament where this was debated 6 days, so robustly debated.
Wow.
And of course, at the end of that, they then made their own report on their findings, and they made various recommendations. And I want to read those recommendations because
this is now COGTA's recommendations.
COGTA's recommendation on the previous time that the CRL tried to bring in this peer review committee.
So this is now in response to the 6 days of debating.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
Having read the report, having heard what everybody thought about it,
Yes.
the CRL having had their day as well to
Yes.
say why they were doing it and why they thought it was a great, wonderful, good idea. And then they made a report on it. And here's just some of the high-level findings.
All right.
Number one, they did not support the CRL's proposal for legislation to regulate the religious sector. Number two, they said that the CRL Rights Commission is not the body that should regulate the religious sector. They also noted that almost everybody, without exception, said that the CRL's recommendations were unconstitutional, i.e. unlawful. And they also noted that many of denominations and other organizations had been self-regulating very well, thank you, and should be kind of left alone.
Yeah, every church has bylaws and every organization has systems in place.
Many of them do.
And then on top of that, like you say, there's the law of the land. So
more and more, and they specifically said, and I'm quoting, that there was the need to protect religious freedom without attempting to regulate it from the side of the state, quote unquote. In other words, leave legislation out of church. Don't regulate the church. That was effectively what they were saying by passing legislation.
All right.
And they said there are enough existing laws to deal with existing challenges and so on. And that seemed to be the end of the matter. One of the things she did was, and she was sanctioned for it in Parliament by COGTA, by the committee, was she openly lied to Parliament. She distorted truth. She put figures up saying these people support when they actually clearly didn't.
Whoa.
And that was exposed. And she was actually told this is a criminal offence. So there was a whole issue around her personal integrity. Should you appoint somebody who lies to Parliament again to chair something which is supposedly objective and neutral and very pro-faith or faith protection? And unfortunately, in December last year, the president reappointed the same person. And immediately, she's back on the same hobby horse. I mean, the first time she spoke out publicly at all, having been appointed, was in February. And I'm going to, again, read what she says. Because bear in mind, as we've just said, Parliament said, leave it alone. This is what she says. She says, society needs help. And we're saying Parliament must pass the relevant regulation that will say it's not business as usual around churches anymore. It's back on the table now, squarely, and we're going to be pushing it through. We're saying there should be a peer review, like you have a peer review for lawyers, for doctors, for social workers, for teachers, for everyone. You need a system that says, you want to open up a church? You want to be a religious leader? You apply first. We test if you don't have an unusual history. The peer review committee will sit down and assess each person and grant them a license to run a church. Does that sound like self-regulation to you?
No.
And she says, looking at the state of the faith communities compared to what it was then and where it is now, she said, it's got a lot worse.
Based on what data?
Based on what data?
Yeah.
Good question. So let's just deconstruct that for a moment. So number one of the things that COGTA asked for was a charter and a code of conduct. Well, we have a religious freedom charter. It was developed with a very broad-based collaborative interfaith or interreligious process back in 2010.
Okay.
And it's an excellent document. The denomination that I'm part of, this is founding the Every Nation Churches, we subscribe to it. In fact, 22 million people represented by their different faith community leaders subscribed to it back in the day. And it unpacks and expounds very well and thoroughly the right to religious freedom, which is obviously more than just a brief sentence of conscience, belief, thought, and opinion and faith. It really unpacks it well. And then what happened after the COGTA parliamentary report came out and said we need a code of conduct is a major sort of church organization called TISA, the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa. They proposed that we took the Religious Freedom Charter as the baseline, like we all agree on what the rights say. So let's ask the same organization that did that process to now do the flip side, if you like, two peas in a pod, or the other side of the coin, and say, well, what then are the corresponding responsibilities? So you have a right.
Yeah.
What's the responsibility? That's the code of conduct. Again, elaborate process took place of consultation and a code of conduct was produced.
Wow.
So that's now in place. Now, when we spoke to the CRL chair last week and we explained that these existing, her view is, well, not everybody who is around now was involved then, so let's scrap it off the table and get right back to the drawing board and do it over again. It's
what?
Like, why would you do that? But anyway.
After all that effort and time and money, sheesh.
Then of course, let's talk about these umbrella organizations. Now, bear in mind, these are all voluntary, and they should be voluntary. You should not be compelled to join an umbrella organization because you have the right of association guaranteed by the Constitution. That means that you can set up and you can become a part of an association, but it equally means that you can decide not to be part of an association.
Yeah.
So let's just take the umbrella organization situation. Let's supposing that, which is what they would like to have, you have to join an umbrella organization. But if you apply that principle across the board equally and fairly, that would mean that you would have to join a political party.
Yeah, sure.
Now, nobody would want to be forced to do that. In other words, it's very fundamental to your human right. But we have, amazingly enough, better and more umbrella organizations, so-called, than we did then. For example, SACOF. You've probably heard of SACOF. SACOF is the South African Community of Faith-Based Fraternals and Federations. Pastor Bert Pretorius is leading that. They have some 220 networks of churches that have come under that banner. They represent some 17,000 plus churches, some nearly 5 million Christians that literally has come into being since 2021.
That's significant.
So how can you say things have got a lot worse?
Yeah, you can't.
You know, they haven't.
It's not based on facts.
No, and also the laws that they were concerned about, like, for example, churches, what entities are a church? Well, the NPO Act has been sufficiently strengthened, and now if you want to effectively do almost anything as a church, you have to register as an NPO, and that means a lot of compliance and auditing of accounts. So everything's got a lot better, not a lot worse. The need for all this is obviously greatly diminished if there ever was a need before. Of course, what she did, which obviously came about around the same time, was Timothy Omatosa was acquitted. And she says, look what happened. Look at that. You know, here was a man, he's potentially a rapist, a sexual trafficking, racketeering. He had 32 indictments against him. And look what happened there. Well, he's actually a poster child for why we don't need extra regulation, because, as she correctly pointed out, he was charged with 32 different crimes.
Yeah.
The fact that the National Prosecuting Authority didn't do a good job and actually bringing it to a point of conviction is an indictment on the capacity of the state or the enforcement capacity or even the political willingness or whatever it was.
Yeah, it's not the legislature.
It's not the fact that we need another layer of legislation, of regulation.
Wow.
And would that stop somebody from committing a crime anyway?
It's such a common sense thing.
It actually is perfect common sense.
It's not about the implementation. It's not about the law itself. It's about the implementation. Yeah.
That's the problem. So,
Sure.
if you can't enforce existing laws,
32 indictments. You would think one would stick if it was true.
But if you can't enforce those, what makes you think that if you have an elaborate system of vetting, of licensing, of managing and monitoring, that you're going to somehow be able to enforce that? And then the question would ask is simple this. What if you, with your license, commit a crime? What happens then?
Yeah.
Well,
who's gonna take care of it?
Is there going to be some separate sort of court? This peer review committee is going to sit as sort of judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah. Who has jurisdiction?
Of course not.
Yeah.
It's going to be back to criminal law.
Wow.
So it's not a solution what they're proposing, but what it is, of course, is it's a very significant and high level of control over the entire religious sector. And
do you think that's the end?
After.
Yeah, that's the end game.
Well,
the agenda.
Fortunately, they're not hiding the ball. They say
She's
the quiet
saying
part
it
out loud.
Yeah.
So I'm going to again read you what she said because it's good get it.
Yes, I want to hear that. Just want to take you back to the first statement you read about her when she came out now again. She specifically used the word churches.
Yes.
Not referring to the Christian faith specifically, because most other faiths have a different word for their gatherings.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
So it seems to be a specific targeting of Christian churches.
100%. No, and again, as I say, the quiet part is being said out loud. So let me tell you what she said, because it's good to get it from her mouth so that nobody can say, I'm making it up. I'm actually quoting what she said.
All right.
She said, we're going to set up a Section 22 committee. Now, Section 22 committee, people said, what is that? The CRL is also governed by an act of Parliament, the CRL Act of 2002. And that's what gives it its powers, its prerogatives. It guides what it can and cannot and should not do. And Section 22 of that act gives it the power to set up committees that actually will investigate specific issues or areas or whatever it is that it feels that it needs to be focusing on, and then potentially push forward for legislation to Parliament. So when she says Section 22 committee, that's what a Section 22 committee is, and that's what it's intended to do. And she says it will be made up of religious leaders who will help us to push through the legislation in Parliament. That's like state regulation, right? Even though she says, no, that's just self-regulation. And convince parliamentarians that this thing needs to happen. And again, she said in another interview on the 1st of April, she said, it's regrettable that the government lost control of the religious sector at the end of apartheid, but this must stop now. So
lost control.
Yeah,
My goodness.
So there seems to be a lack of understanding, perhaps, of the role that she should be playing in the role that she's been given.
It's not control, it's protection. There's a difference, from what I understand.
Information, it's helping, it's bringing reconciliation and understanding, not control. That's the last thing they should be doing. But she now has set up this Section 22 committee and given it a mandate. And the mandate is, obviously, it's going to be undertaking, and this is where we all need to wake up and pay attention. It's going to be undertaking meetings to investigate in all the different provinces, and they want to try and conclude this process sometime between now and August. So this is something to be
It's happening now.
Very aware of and very ready for. What it's going to be looking to do, and I'm quoting, is it's going to do extensive research to assess the scale and impact of abuse of people's beliefs and harmful religious practices in eroding the religious rights of Christian believers. So it's going to undertake this investigation specifically in what's referred to as the Christian sector.
Wow.
In other words, it's laser targeted at the Christian faith. And then it's going to develop strategies to deal with and curb spiritual transgressions.
Spiritual transgressions.
Of which there's no such thing in law. But what business does the state have in looking at what might be a spiritual transgression? I mean, do we want the state to judge on what is sin or not?
Yeah.
Of course not. It's ridiculous.
Wow.
And then, of course, what's it going to do? It's going to make recommendations for a legal and or legislative framework to promote peer review mechanisms in the religious sector, which was exactly what they were told not to do. So that is really the foregone conclusion. By the way, she claims, and she claimed in our meeting, that they're duty-bound to follow this because of the COGTA report. Well, number one, the COGTA report made recommendations that are non-binding. They're only binding if Parliament subsequently passes a resolution on them. They haven't. So that's not true, and it's not accurate in law. And secondly, the CRL is supposed to be independent, and therefore it cannot be bound to do something. That would be contrary to its entire nature or reason for existence. So she's saying things that are patently wrong in law and obviously not true, but certainly self-serving in terms of what she's trying to achieve. There was a big challenge at the meeting that I was at, because we were there also with members of the Islamic faith community. And they said, like, why are you targeting just Christians? That's not fair. Because, of course, bear in mind, religious freedom applies to all faiths equally.
Yeah.
So if they target the Christian faith and they come up with a system to regulate and monitor and control the Christian faith, they're going to be doing the same thing for the Islamic
They
faith,
might copy and paste.
No, well, you can't pass a law that has any application to one faith. That would be unfair discrimination.
But but every faith is so different. So it's interesting that they want to apply the same rules.
Well, they can't. In other words, what I'm saying is that let's suppose you have a system which says you have to register every mosque, every religious organization.
Yes.
That would include mosques.
Yes.
That would include temples. That would include synagogues. So, in other words, that law would have general application. But of course, it's very unfair and obviously biased. Don't forget there's a principle of equality before the law in our constitution.
So what did the Muslims say at that meeting?
No, they were very upset because what they're saying is that if you conduct this investigation into the Christian faith and you then come up with conclusions and you want to pass legislation to regulate and license and control the Christian sector, that's going to apply equally to us. We haven't even had a say. And her response was, well, I'm looking at the census, Christians are first, you're next, and then, but...
In terms of numbers, or what?
But that's not how the law works.
Wow.
So there seems to be a complete sort of disconnect between actually legal process or due process and what they're doing. But
she seems to have a lot of power. Does the power she's wielding, does she actually have that power, or is she just pushing to have the power and wield it anyway?
She is pushing for powers that she has not been granted.
Yeah.
And she would like to have more powers, obviously, and more control, obviously, and more money, obviously.
Yeah.
Because power, control, and money, the three always
Michael, can I take you back a moment?
Sure.
And you might not want to answer this question, but why do you think Ramaphosa put her back in that position if everyone opposed it? What would the reason be?
The way the selection process works for people who are appointed to the CRL, this is different from other commissions, where there's a much more public participatory process, is that a committee was appointed to look at possible candidates, and then that committee made recommendations to the president, who just went tick, 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 tick.
Okay.
Now, I don't think that's any excuse, by the way, because he had received a specific appeal signed by representatives of 12 million people.
She shouldn't have been on the list in the first place.
Never appoint this lady again.
Yeah.
And he went ahead and did it anyway. So, whether there's an agenda, who knows? We don't necessarily think there's, or we never attribute bad intent to government, but the fact of the matter is that it's borderline negligent to have not at least gone back and referred, because surely he hadn't forgotten the obviously deep divisions and debacle that the previous tenure actually entailed.
It smells like something, but okay, all right.
But be that as it may.
Yeah, so she's back on the horse.
So she's back on the horse, and here's what she said. She said, we started way back in 2017, and we're more agitated now than we've ever been before.
Oh, great. So it's an emotional attack.
She's very emotional. We will be pushing with everything we have to make sure that this thing happens.
Wow.
Now, again, the problem is this committee, which is supposedly independent of the CRL. I said to her, you claim it's independent, but you are providing the secretarial services, the administrative services, you're financing it, and you're also overseeing it. How is it therefore independent in terms of its investigation? Obviously it's not.
Yeah.
So it's really a
say?
foregone conclusion. Well, more to the point, what does the chair who's been appointed to this commission, to head this committee rather, said, a professor, and I'm sure I'll get his name wrong, Musa Xulu, Xulu. I'm sure I pronounced that badly.
All right, that's okay.
But his statement was he's going to be conducting this nationwide meetings and investigations looking for all this abuse, which is obviously some form of a witch hunt. After which she said it will be possible for a legislative framework to establish a board that will take responsibility for the religious sector. In other words, it's a foregone conclusion.
Wow.
It's just a box-ticking exercise.
So they're completely ignoring the whole process that happened back in 2017 to 2020, and then now they're just doing it again, just going ahead.
Absolutely.
And am I correct in assuming that the funding that they have is essentially taxpayer money? It's tax money that they're using for this, or would they be funded by something else?
Well, I asked again the question because we have to ask these good questions.
Where's the money coming from?
Where's the money coming from?
Yeah.
Now we did a calculation, just a simple calculation, that there are approximately an estimated some 150,000 religious organizations that would qualify to be registered under the regime that she intends.
Regime.
And well, it is a regime.
Yeah.
And it also says that if you're a religious practitioner, you also have to register and be licensed and vetted, of course. And so I asked her, I said, well, how do you define that? Because that doesn't seem to be defined anywhere. Now, she's very obviously passionate about the fact that, in her view, the church is filled with pedophiles. If she said pedophile once in the conversation we had, she said it probably 30 or 40 times. There's apparently riddled with pedophiles.
Oh, really?
The church. It's
okay, and that's the whole church, every church.
Potentially, it's their primary sort of hunting ground, so to speak. And so that's one of the reasons why everybody has to be vetted. Now, let me stop and say this: that very importantly, and certainly something that we have always recommended, is that if you are using people in your church for children's ministry or youth ministry, then there are laws which says that you should actually make sure that those people are indeed kosher.
And vetted.
And vetted.
Absolutely.
So there's mandatory reporting under the Children's Act that if anybody does commit a crime, which is like child abuse, in your church, you can't just cover it up and say it's no, not at all. It's a criminal act and you're under a duty to report it. Fair enough. And then, of course, there's the mandatory checks. So you can go, for example, to the National Register for Sex Offenders or the National Child Protection Register to see if those people, and it's a free inquiry, are on that list. And obviously if they are, you know what to do.
Yeah. So,
and churches should have a policy in that respect.
So once again, there's already things in place to police all these concerns that she has raised.
100%.
Yeah.
So these are all in place. Oh. So I've lost track of your question. What was your original question? I got slightly red-herringed on that.
No, I think we've answered it, so we can move on. Yeah, it's fine.
No, well, it'll come back to us. It'll come back to us. So we I think we were talking as well about the whole question of why is this a focus and where is this focus? And the answer to that is it does seem to be targeting the Christian faith. Obviously, that's a given, and it's coming very shortly. This process, and obviously they want to be pushing it through as hard and as fast as they can.
It almost seems like she's got skin in the game, in the sense of even knowing someone that has been hurt by the church or affected by the church in a negative way. Like that's what I'm hearing. Is maybe it's a chase for power on the one hand, but there seems to be a personal vendetta almost behind it. She might have a person that she knows and loves that's been hurt by some church leader, and now everyone has to, be burnt in a way.
There's no doubt about it. People do get hurt in the church,
unfortunately,
in religious spaces. That happens. It's always happened.
And we're not saying that doesn't happen.
No.
But you are saying, and I agree, there's already systems in place to deal with that if it is applied properly.
Absolutely.
And that's the big thing.
And so this system, I remember the question you asked me now. So this system is going to basically be looking into how to vet and then obviously register and license religious organizations, of which we guesstimate there's 150,000, and whoever qualifies as a religious practitioner.
Yeah.
Now,
religious practitioner. You were defining that.
I asked her, what is your definition of a religious practitioner? She said, well, it's not just the office bearers. In other words, the people whose names are on the paper if you register as an NPO. And I said, well, who else would it be? Because obviously it's going to be your pastor, your senior pastor, your pastoral staff, your team, your worship leader, yes. Obviously children's ministry, yes. Youth workers, yes. Home group, small group leaders, yes. So
it's everyone.
It's pretty much everyone.
Wow.
And what that means is, and let's just be conservative and say that you're registering 150,000 religious organizations, and each one of those organizations has got, say, 4 people that will qualify as religious.
That's very conservative, yeah.
Maybe it's conservative. I mean, don't forget, different churches, different sizes.
Yeah.
Well, do the math. I mean, number one, you're going to have a massive bureaucracy to actually police and administrate all this. I mean, we guesstimate that it will require a staff of at least 200 to 300 people just to
run the whole thing. Yeah.
And offices all over the country.
And I mean, our government has shown that they can do things like that. Sorry. But I think the only government system that works well is SARS. The rest they've either broken or they're trying to start new things and it's not working as well.
Well, they'll have to put a massive, obviously, and highly developed CRM IT system together to...
It's offices, it's salaries, it's going to be a massive cost to the country.
It's a huge bureaucracy.
Massive cost to the country.
We estimate that the setup cost, just the startup cost of doing it, probably approximating $750 million, maybe $1 billion.
And it's an unnecessary spend. We have things in place that just have to apply them well.
Well, let's suppose it goes ahead. You've got the initial take on, and then, of course, you have to manage it and maintain it year upon year.
Yeah.
So, when I said to her, where is the money going to come from this? She said, Parliament will decide.
Oh, yeah, that was my question. Where does the money come from?
So Parliament will decide, apparently. So you have to ask the question, well, looking at the state of the economy, the state of parliamentary government finances, the budget, as we've recently discovered, was not an easy one to resolve. How much money is sloshing around looking for projects to allocate it to? None.
Yeah.
Where's that money going to come from? In all likelihood, if you are licensed, your church is licensed, you are licensed, who's going to pay your license fee? You are. So effectively, it's going to be a tax.
A mandatory cost to churches.
Tax to churches. And you will basically be paying for yourself to be policed.
Wow.
You'll be kind of pay the jailer.
That's hectic. That's hectic. My goodness.
So this is all in play. And let's not be delusional about these things. It's happening now.
Yeah.
It's not something that's in the sweet by and by in some parallel universe.
It's about to happen.
Right now. In the next few months, this is going to be unfolding. So,
why do you guys say this is unconstitutional? What's happening?
Well, there are a number of reasons. The one is, of course, that whenever you start to investigate whether or not somebody's faith or belief is acceptable, or to actually inquire into it, then you immediately come up against Section 15 of the Constitution. My right to believe is defined by the Constitutional Court as a belief that even if it is bizarre, irrational, or illogical, incapable of any form of proof, it is still protected by the Constitution, therefore by law.
Wow, okay, that's interesting.
So I can believe anything I want to. Now, the CRL seem to think that what their mandate is to protect Christian orthodoxy. So they're saying to church leaders, and you'll find church leaders nodding, aren't you embarrassed by the crazy things that some of these so-called pastors are doing and saying? And wouldn't you like to see some form of proper standards, maintained? Because your faith is coming into disrepute and it's a stain on Christianity, and we want to help you.
It's not a manipulative question at all. Yeah.
And of course, some pastors at that point are nodding. But here's the thing, constitutionally, your human right is you can believe whatever you want. We don't all necessarily agree on what Christian orthodoxy should mean. In fact, globally, there are some 2,000 different expressions of the Christian faith that vary in some way or another.
Yeah.
So which one do you pick? And should you then force everybody to believe that? And if you don't, or if you won't do the mandatory course of maybe a 2 or 3 year degree that you'll have to have, which is what happens in Angola, for example, that you're not actually allowed to be a religious practitioner. Is that what we want? The answer is obviously not.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
it's not their job to push for any form of Christian orthodoxy. And if you do, obviously you're going to be infringing people's religious freedom right, which is Section 15. And then, of course, we've mentioned the freedom of association. If you say you have to belong to a particular umbrella organization that's approved, that's been vetted, well, your right to association guaranteed by Section 18 is also your right not to associate. You can't be forced to join the club, so to speak.
Yeah, being forced to join a voluntary club. It makes no sense.
It's a contradiction in terms, and,
Wow.
and it's an abuse of your constitutional right.
Okay.
And then, of course, the Constitution protects the collective rights of individuals. So we're allowed to form organizations and associations and belong to them.
Yeah.
You can't go, well, only if we approve, because that violates your Section 31 right.
Yeah.
So in those 3 ways, and that's just don't get me started, but I mean, that is just
The obvious
some
ones.
of the obvious ones why it's unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, if this ever were to go through and they're successful and this starts to be clamped down, you'll see actually more problems pop up because people are going to now go, ooh, I have to just change the entity with which I do it, call it something else, and the church will go underground, a part of it anyway. And then I think you'll get more crazy people doing more crazy things. Well, because this is China. I mean, China has a regulated church, from what I understand. My brother goes to one. He lives there. And he says, for all intents and purposes, it seems fine. But then, they are very much controlled by the state. That there's a reason why there's a massive underground church in China operating. And that's what you will probably essentially see happening, is some kind of underground movement.
I think that's the most likely outcome. But again, the CRL said to us at the meeting that they're looking at other African examples where religious regulation has come into play.
I think you said Angola and Rwanda.
Rwanda are obviously 2 of them. So let's look at that, because that might be the shape of things to come.
Yeah,
in
how's
South
that
Africa.
going?
Well, in August last year, there was a report in Rwanda that 9,800 so-called prayer houses had been closed down and 7,000 churches
closed down.
Shut down.
By the government. Because they don't
for whatever reason, they didn't comply with whatever regulation that they stipulated.
Oh, my word.
So, obviously Rwanda is a very tiny country. So, if you extrapolate that, say, into the South African context, you'd be probably talking about, maybe sort of, 30, 40,000 prayer houses and maybe sort of, 15, 20,000 churches shut down. Is that the power that we think government should have, given the fact that we have the right to religious freedom? Absolutely not. Angola, another example that I think she's favorably inclined towards, because she does say that there must be some form of standard. As I mentioned at the beginning, that, she says, look, there's no difference between somebody who's a religious practitioner and somebody who's a lawyer, an accountant, a doctor. There must be some form of standard. Well,
so the pastors have to write like a bar exam.
Yeah. So Angola has such a thing.
Oh, wow.
And they also have a particular restriction on whether you can start a church or not. You have to have 60,000 signatures in order to start. And
it's more than you need for a religious or a political party.
And the kicker is that every one of those has to be notarized by a state notarizing agent, and it costs you $30 a pop.
Wow.
So if you want to start a church in Angola, you're looking at like a startup fee of 8 to 10 million rand.
Why don't they just put up a poster and say, we don't want churches?
Well, they don't. And
that's what they're saying.
Well, they've shut down 2,000.
Yeah.
So they obviously don't want as many as they have.
Are they a communist state? I'm not sure.
I don't know the political dispensation.
Interesting.
But here's the thing. When you start to say there must be some body of doctrine, that doesn't apply to the faith community. It certainly applies to lawyers and doctors. I mean, I want to make sure when I go under...
There should be a standard.
Under anesthetic, that the guy who's going to operate on me is actually studied a long time.
Yeah, he didn't
kind
get
of knows what the
50%
body's
for
like.
biology. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. He didn't just wake up one day and think, I'm called to be a surgeon and start sharpening his kitchen knife.
Of course, lives are at stake.
Of course.
Yeah.
But when it comes to faith is by definition fluid. And as I've said, even if you are believing something that is off the wall crazy, you're entitled to do it as long as you don't harm anybody.
Yeah.
You can't
and
harm
there are
anybody.
laws for that. Again, we're back to
All covered.
there are enough things in place that just need to be implemented.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Properly enforced. And again, and I think that maybe brings us to the sort of unworkability of this whole thing. It is a massive exercise to try and put such a system into play. How on earth are you going to do it? And how are you going to do it and stay within the realm of the Constitution and what the law dictates? So
yeah, because there's room to abuse now. How can this be abused once it's in
what
place?
What happens if you disagree with a peer review committee?
Yeah.
What happens if you just say, well, I'm not going to comply with that because that really violates my conscience? What are the sanctions? Is it a fine? Because ultimately, if you're fined and you won't pay the fine, the ultimate sanction is you get put in jail.
Sure.
So how is all this going to end? In other words, it's going to end badly. And we need to wake up and we need to be alert. But I think most importantly, and this is maybe where we should start to land this conversation, I think we would all agree that the church is not without problems. The faith communities, generally speaking, are not without problems. There are always bad actors in every area of society. So I think what we should be doing is we should be saying, look, we're not denying that there are problems. These problems exist. They've existed since the beginning of time. As I said, since Judas was stealing out of the purse, they've been existent. But there are plenty of solutions that require no further legal action or legislation that could be implemented today. And let me just run a couple by you. So, for example, ministers' networks and fraternals. Yes. Join one.
Yeah.
Voluntarily.
Yes.
It's a great thing to be part of one because you get a lot of input, you get a level of accountability, you get best practice, you get often help to actually make sure that you're compliant in things that you might actually not know that you're needing to be compliant in. And you get good independence. And of course, there's always the possibility that you can get some help if you have an issue, that other people who you now have a relationship with can come and help you sort some stuff out. That's a good one. And of course, Sakov, we've mentioned, is the kind of poster child of a new, massive umbrella organization, so-called, that you can be part of. Then we've spoken about the Religious Freedom Charter and the Code of Conduct. They both exist. They've been thoroughly worked through and by a collaborative process developed. And if you haven't seen them, you can certainly get them from the 4SA website. And we recommend that you actually integrate that into your constitution if you have a church. Because, number one, it's very helpful if you ever face some form of legal action to have embedded in your constitution, this is how we understand religious faith. And that's part of your protection.
Yeah.
And frankly, if you don't want to abide by the Code of Conduct, that might say something about you, because there's nothing in it that is in any way unreasonable or that you shouldn't expect from a legitimate, good faith religious organization. And people can check this out for themselves. Again, but those are voluntary, not compulsory. Then, of course, greater training, greater levels of education. Everybody, when I ask people, are you in a pastoral role because you educated yourself for that or because you were called to be that? Everybody puts their hand up for calling. But here's the thing. Study to show yourself approved. Educate your calling. That, I think, is a responsible thing to do. And there are plenty of opportunities. But again, they shouldn't be compelled. You should be able to choose. How do you do that process? But obviously, being compliant with existing legislation, I mean, you run a church. If you employ people, you have to pay UIF and their taxes. If you rent a building or you build a building, you've got building. I mean, there's a ton of
regulations already in place
that cover you. You're not like this Wild West.
Sort of doing what you want to do.
Do whatever you want to do. No, not at all. So, but educate yourself. Find out what that involves. And obviously, the CRL should do what it's also mandated to do, which is to look into reports. So if an abuse is reported and you report it to the CRL, they have, in terms of their own act, as I mentioned, they have an act of parliament that tells them what they can and cannot do. They have broad and sweeping powers to investigate. They can issue subpoenas, for example. They can look into things. And then when they find out something that they think needs to be dealt with, they have the power to engage with any organ of state and to recommend the action that they should take to remedy what they found. That's a broad power.
And that's actually what they should be doing.
That's what they should be doing.
Yeah.
So, do your job. In other words, you have the power. You don't need more power to do that.
Yeah.
So,
and we don't need more laws and more regulations. We actually just need the ones that are there to be applied.
And they're
in
empowered.
An effective way.
They're empowered to do just that.
Yeah.
So they already have that. We've spoken, of course, about registering children's workers and youth workers. As churches, you should be doing that. You should have a policy for that. If you don't, put your house in order.
Yeah.
And it's just the right thing, if not the legal thing that you should be doing. And then, of course, last but not least, the CRL has, in its existing Act of Parliament, the power to register religious organizations and experts, which would be obviously office bearers, senior pastors, and so on. There's a big difference between registration and regulation. Like, I will, if I apply for a loan, have to produce my bank account details, my ID document, my, certain information, which I have no problem presenting. And if you register as an NPO, you're going to be obliged to do certain things, put in your annual audited accounts, etc. So they can register today. They're empowered to do so. If we don't like that, then you're going to have to change their act or you're going to have to change the constitution. But they have that power today. They don't need this extra power that they're obviously after. And in the registration process, by the way, you can certainly raise some red flags, and maybe that's what this should be used to do. So, for example, one legitimate question would be, if you say that you're a church and you put in your NPO, do you have a bank account? No. Oh, okay. Like, what?
Why? Where's it going?
What do you do with the money you take? And if the answer is, well, we throw it up in the air, whatever God wants, He keeps, and the rest just trouser.
I haven't heard that one. That's good. We throw it up in the air, whatever God wants.
That's
a good one.
The next call is to SARS.
Yeah.
What about a pastor who says, "What's your ID number?" and they give a foreign passport? Well, the next obvious question is, do you have a work permit? And if the answer is no, well, the next call is to Home Affairs, and probably they should be on the plane out because they're breaking the law.
Yeah.
So they have all these powers existent today. Every solution that I've put forward solves the problem. Proper law enforcement, obviously being high up there today, with no further laws.
With no further cost.
No further cost, no further laws.
Yeah.
Why are they pushing, as she said, with all their might, agitatedly for this?
Interesting.
It could only be power, control, and probably money.
And I think there's a part of that they just want to shut churches down.
Well,
because they might be jealous of the power that churches do have and the money that they make, and I don't know. Maybe there's even a broader, spiritual battle going on. Because obviously, as a Christian, I believe there's an enemy. He wants to stop the work of God, and what better way than to work through a state agency to do that? So, but that's maybe down a rabbit hole.
Look, we don't subscribe bad intention to government, but I think it's fair enough to say this, that outside of political parties, the only societal institution that actually has the capacity to produce and convey an alternative narrative to the narrative of government, or even now mainstream media, which is very often a kind of a spokesperson, sadly, for that same narrative, who can actually formulate it with authority and send it to grassroots level, is the church. And historically, the church has played a very critical role in speaking truth to power, in bringing levels of accountability to government, because it is that moral compass, if you like.
Yeah, consciousness of the country.
So a classic example would be, of course, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was very much a lead figure, and not just him. Dr. Frank Chicani was another, and there are others besides, who were that voice that was almost prophetic. Now, if you license and thereby control and can shut down and potentially criminalize voices that you don't like, then that, I would say, is another serious threat to not just the faith communities, but to the democratic process writ large.
Of course. Yeah.
So, again, we're not subscribing bad intent to government, but the bottom line is that if the state can actually end up controlling through regulation and licensing the religious sector, you would certainly have that latent power and capacity in the hands of the state. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. All right. So what do we do about this? How should Christian leadership, Christians respond, maybe other people of other faith communities? What would your advice be? How do we, because they seem to be bulldozing forward. Is there anything we can do right now? Is there still going to be some kind of way to interfere, I almost want to say, or get involved? How do we stop this from going all the way? Is there a way?
Well, the first thing is get informed.
Yeah.
If you're watching this podcast, vlogcast, I'm not quite sure what we are.
Both, yeah.
If you're watching this, listening to this, send it on to your pastor, send it on to others, and listen up.
Make them aware.
Because we have to be aware of the issues and the arguments. Secondarily, very importantly, these hearings of this Section 22 committee that's been set up to conduct this investigative process will be conducted around the country in the different provinces. And when I spoke to the chair of that committee, he said that they wanted to try and conclude this by August. That's a fast-moving train.
Very.
Whether they get that right, I don't know. But obviously it's imminent. When you hear, and we for SA will be informing you, so keep an eye on our website, subscribe to our newsletters, look at our Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA. When you hear that there's a meeting that has been convened by the Section 22 committee, go to it. Don't go, go to that meeting. Ask the questions that need to be asked to reveal the agenda behind it, and also the unworkability, the complete lack of necessity, the unconstitutionality of what's being proposed. Because that committee could only report back on what it finds during its hearings. So if it's hearing a uniform response, which is no thank you, and for very good reason, that's what they have to report on. They can't just ignore that input and just go and say something completely different. So very importantly is always public participation. Make your voice heard.
How will we hear about these meetings in our cities or towns or areas? Do you know?
The only reliable way, I would suggest, is follow 4SA.
Okay.
Because we're going to be watching this like the proverbial hawk. And one thing that we learned the last time is that they don't want objecting voices
to show up. So they try to announce it without announcing it too broadly, or what?
Back to 2017 when the report came out. Now we know, and we knew then, that this report had to be taken to Parliament for a hearing, because only when Parliament, i.e. COGTA that we mentioned, who actually oversight the CRL, have actually heard it and made a recommendation, can the thing move forward? So we knew that was going to happen. And we obviously knew that what they were pushing for was COGTA to tick the box, and then it goes off into legislation. We literally, every day, we were looking at the rolls, Parliament, phoning the CRL, when's this going to happen? Didn't hear anything. The night before, late afternoon before the first hearing took place, we were notified it wasn't even listed as a room booked at Parliament. Myself, Advocate Nadine Badenhorst, 4SA, gate crashed the hearing. Packed to capacity. Full of people who nobody had ever seen or heard of before.
Wow.
All cosplaying, dressed up with sort of collars and whatever, all thanking the chair for caring so much and for helping, and of course, endless videos playing of people eating snakes and grass and drinking petrol and all that sort of thing. And she's making impassioned speeches about how we must put a stop to this. And of course, the parliamentarians who really don't know much about what's happening here are thinking, wow, and we need help.
Yeah.
And at the end of that whole afternoon
Spiel. Oh.
the chair said, is there anybody else who maybe hasn't had the opportunity to speak who'd like to bring anything to the committee's attention? This is a democracy and everybody must have a say. And if you'd like to say something, this is your moment.
Yeah. Yes.
And in 15 minutes, we destroyed all the arguments that were for it and basically brought the law to play. That's what we did.
Well done.
We just simply said, this is what the law says. And the cognitive chair at that point says, look, we can't obviously therefore make a decision on this. There obviously needs to be more hearings, especially as what you're saying is that this group is not actually representative of the faith communities, which of course it was not. And now we're going to have other hearings. That's why there ended up being 6 days hearings, not just the one tick the box.
So they packed the room with yes men and just try to push this through.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so sneaky.
So I mean, really,
wow.
4SA literally saved the day.
You did.
And
thank you.
And
South Africa thanks you. Wow.
So we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be monitoring it. And when we say there's going to be a meeting in, say, the Western Cape at such and such a venue at such and such a time, as a leader,
rock up,
go there, raise the issues, raise the questions, point out the flaws and the fallacies behind all this. Because if you don't, then you will live with the consequences.
Yeah. Can we assume they will have at least one in every province?
That's what they say.
Okay.
Yes.
So we can look out for at least one in each province in whatever the capital of that province will be, I'm assuming. Yeah. And we need to get and
maybe
frankly,
they should do more. If they're going to do a, let's say, properly measured, so particularly because don't forget, this is going to fundamentally change the relationship between the faith communities and the state.
Yeah.
If what they want happens, it's a fundamental foundational change. So, yes, don't just sit on your hands and do nothing. Get involved, get engaged.
Sure. You're like a Jeremiah, brother. You're like lamenting what's happening and trying to make the people wake up and see it. And it's necessary that we do this. Maybe we can get as practical as, drafting those points and questions and sending it or making it available. So those who want to go to those meetings are armed with the right information, the right questions to ask them. Because some people might feel, listen, I'll go, but I don't know what to say or whatever. Yeah. So let's empower, let's help, and let's get this across the nation because it's so important.
We will be doing exactly that.
Okay.
So we don't want it to be so standard that everybody's just reading the same question off the page. But we're going to be producing a one-pager that's going to basically highlight bullet point the main issues of concern. Again, watch this video. We're going to have a PDF, which is going to be basically like a PowerPoint that's going to go through all the different issues so that even if you as a leader don't really know what it is, this will give you all the information you need and also give you the capacity to share it with others and to tell others.
And if I can appeal to every leader that's a good communicator, because most of us should be good communicators, we're communicating the word of God, let this information sink in. Find your own way of expressing it and go and be the voice for your church and your area. Yep. I think that's important.
And tell others.
This is why God gave us the ability to communicate. Yeah. Let's get the word out. Yeah.
Inform others. The other thing we're going to be doing, which I think is going to be quite helpful, is we're going to be producing a short series of like video memes, each with 1.1 question per little meme. And
that's great.
It will have a little bit of text. If you play it, it will be my voice actually making a statement and asking a question.
Okay.
And that's also going to be available. We're going to push that through WhatsApp, through Instagram, through all over the place. And it's going to be on our website too as a kind of a resource. You can download it and share it.
All right.
So again, I think the appeal is get the word out. Don't just be informed yourself, but inform others. Yes. Be that agent of sort of transformation.
Help to get the word out. Absolutely.
Get the word out. And then, of course, very importantly, when these meetings happen, go to them. Raise the questions. Make your voice heard.
All right. Michael, thanks. And thanks for what you guys are doing at 4SA. I cannot encourage people enough to support you by helping to spread the word, by contributing financially and helping to make happen what needs to happen. You are doing great work and it's so necessary. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Any final thoughts or words you want to share at this point?
I think we always ask people to do three things for 4SA. We ask, first of all, for prayer. You know, as you mentioned, we don't fight against flesh and blood. And to be in the position that we are in, we are definitely on the front lines of the fight for faith and freedom. And that's not always the easiest place to be. And it often comes back in the form of some pretty serious challenges that we who work in 4SA face in our personal lives.
Can imagine.
I don't want to go into those in any detail, but it is way beyond what is, I would say, like normal, shall we say. Sickness, deaths in the family, financial challenges, you name it.
Have you ever received death threats? Or
I've been warned a couple of times that I'm, not making any good friends in high places, and I should be careful, quote unquote. But I couldn't care less, to be honest.
That's real, man.
My trust and my faith and belief is that I'm immortal until I fulfill God's purpose and His plan for my life.
Beautiful. So, thank you.
To that point, bring it on. In fact, don't. Just put put some prayer cover around us. So prayer is the one thing.
Okay.
Obviously, participation. We've mentioned that. Like, get involved, get informed, and show up and make your voice heard. That's very important. And then, of course, provision. Because we only can do this because some wonderful churches, individuals, some organizations financially support us.
Okay.
We have no other form of funding. So if you value what we do and you want us to stay in the game, fighting for faith and freedom for you, then please consider how you might support us and partner with us financially.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Thank you for what you guys are doing. We will definitely keep praying and helping and getting the word out as much as we can. And from my side, everyone listening, just help us to get the word out. Help us to spread it to wherever it needs to go. And this, once again, it doesn't just affect the Christian community. No. It's the whole all faiths. So you can share this with your Muslim brothers, your whoever of a different faith, and say, listen, this won't just affect us.
Absolutely.
They might be coming for us first, but, so it's a national emergency, I want to say, that we cannot allow this to happen, and we have to stand up. Thank you so much for what you're doing and for inspiring me as well. We say boldness is contagious, and I feel emboldened. So thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Heinz. Great to be with you.